The air in the grand hall was thick with tension. Outside, the African sun blazed over Luanda, but inside the Portuguese governor's residence, a different kind of heat simmered. It was 1622, and the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. A woman entered the chamber with such commanding presence that even the armed Portuguese guards straightened unconsciously. She wore robes that spoke of royalty, adorned with symbols of power that predated European arrival by centuries. Her eyes swept the room with the calm assessment of a military strategist surveying a battlefield. This was no ordinary diplomatic mission. This was war by other means. Governor João Correia de Sousa sat in his ornate chair, positioned on a raised platform to emphasize Portuguese superiority. He had orchestrated every detail of this meeting to humiliate the African delegation. No chairs for the visitors, only reed mats on the floor. The message was unmistakable: kneel before European power or stand in shame. But the woman who stood before him was Nzinga Mbande, and she had not come to kneel. What happened next would echo through centuries. With a subtle gesture, one of her attendants immediately understood. He dropped to his hands and knees before her. Without a moment's hesitation, without a flicker of doubt crossing her face, Nzinga sat upon his back as though it were the throne of her ancestors. She adjusted her robes with deliberate grace, then locked eyes with the governor. In that single act, she shattered his carefully constructed theater of domination. The Portuguese had brought cannons and muskets to Africa. They had built forts and filled their ships with stolen lives. But here, in this moment, an African woman wielded a weapon they could not match: absolute, unshakable dignity. The governor's face betrayed his shock. He had expected submission, perhaps protest, maybe even anger. He had not expected to be outmaneuvered before a single word was spoken. The other Portuguese officials shifted uncomfortably. The translators held their breath. Everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was Queen Nzinga, and her story begins not in this moment of triumph, but decades earlier, in a world that was already being torn apart. The year was 1583. In the highlands of what the world would later call Angola, a child was born into royalty and into crisis. The kingdom of Ndongo stretched across fertile valleys where the Mbundu people had built a civilization of remarkable sophistication. They worked iron into tools and weapons. They cultivated crops that fed thriving communities. They traded salt and copper across networks that connected distant kingdoms. They had laws, art, music, spiritual traditions. They had everything that made a society great. And the Portuguese wanted to destroy it all. The baby girl born that year came into the world with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. The diviners who attended the birth spoke in hushed, reverent tones. This was an omen, they said. This child would be proud. This child would be fierce. This child was marked by the ancestors for greatness. They named her Nzinga. Her father, King Kiluanji, was not a man given to superstition, but he was a man who understood the times in which he lived. European ships had been appearing on African shores for nearly a century. At first, they came as traders. They spoke of partnership, of mutual benefit, of Christian brotherhood. But their true purpose soon became horrifyingly clear. They came for people. By the time Nzinga could walk, Portuguese slave ships were already carrying thousands of Africans across the Atlantic every year. Men, women, children, ripped from their homes and transformed into property. The Portuguese built their fortress at Luanda in 1575, and from that coastal stronghold they pushed inland like a disease spreading through a body. King Kiluanji watched neighboring kingdoms fall. He watched African leaders sell their own people for European goods. He watched warfare transform from disputes over land and honor into raids designed to capture human beings for sale. He watched, and he prepared his children for the storm that was coming. Nzinga was not raised like other royal daughters. While girls of her status in other kingdoms might have been sheltered, taught only domestic arts and ceremonial roles, Nzinga learned to fight. Her father insisted on it. She trained with spears and shields alongside her brothers. She learned the tactics of warfare, how to read terrain, how to anticipate an enemy's movements, how to turn disadvantage into opportunity. But physical combat was only one part of her education. King Nzinga understood that the Portuguese threat could not be defeated by spears alone. These Europeans had guns, cannons, ships. They had technologies that gave them devastating advantages in open battle. Defeating them would require something more than martial skill. It would require understanding them. So Nzinga learned Portuguese. She studied their language with the same intensity she brought to weapons training. She listened when Portuguese traders and officials visited her father's court. She observed how they negotiated, how they made promises they never intended to keep, how they exploited divisions among African peoples. She learned to recognize the gap between their words and their intentions. She was still a girl when she first saw the slave caravans. Long lines of her people, shackled together, being marched toward the coast. The image burned itself into her memory. The chains, the blank, traumatized faces. The Portuguese soldiers who treated human beings like cattle. These were Mbundu people. These were her people. And they were being erased from their own land. Her father fought back as best he could. King Nzinga understood he could not defeat Portugal in conventional warfare. They had too many guns, too many resources, too many African collaborators willing to betray their neighbors for European trade goods. So he fought smart. He used guerrilla tactics, striking Portuguese positions and fading back into familiar territory. He built alliances with other kingdoms, trying to create unified resistance. He negotiated when necessary, buying time to rebuild strength. Nzinga absorbed every lesson. She saw that survival required flexibility. When you were strong, you pressed the attack. When you were weak, you retreated and preserved your forces. When the enemy expected one thing, you gave them another. Never fight on their terms. Always seek advantage, even in apparent defeat. The Portuguese campaigns grew more brutal as Nzinga reached adulthood. In 1579, and again through the 1590s, massive Portuguese expeditions pushed deep into Ndongo territory. They burned villages, they destroyed crops. They killed anyone who resisted and enslaved everyone else. These were not military campaigns in any traditional sense. They were systematic attempts to terrorize entire populations into submission. Thousands died, thousands more disappeared into slavery. The kingdom's infrastructure was devastated, but Ndongo did not fall. King Nzinga and his warriors, including his daughter Nzinga, made the Portuguese pay for every advance. They made occupation so costly, so dangerous, so unprofitable, that the Europeans could never fully consolidate their control. By the early 1600s, Nzinga had become her father's most trusted advisor. She sat in council meetings with nobles who had decades more experience, and her insights were often the sharpest in the room. Some resented her influence. A woman, they muttered, should not wield such power. But King Nzinga valued competence over custom, and his daughter had proven herself time and again. She understood something that many others missed. The Portuguese were not invincible. They had advantages, yes, but they also had weaknesses. They were far from home, dependent on long supply lines. They were vulnerable to disease in Africa's climate. Their numbers were limited. Most importantly, they needed African cooperation to make their colonial project work. Without African guides, African soldiers, African traders willing to supply them with slaves, the Portuguese system would collapse. This insight would shape everything Nzinga did for the rest of her life. King Nzinga died in 1617, worn out by decades of constant warfare. The throne passed to Nzinga's brother, Mbandi. And with that succession, everything changed. Mbandi was not his father. Where Nzinga had been strategic and measured, Mbandi was impulsive and paranoid. Where Nzinga had valued loyalty and competence, Mbandi saw threats everywhere. He looked at his sister and saw not an ally, but a rival. His first acts as king revealed his character. He ordered the execution of Nzinga's young son. The child was killed not for any crime, not for any threat he posed, but simply because Mbandi feared potential rivals to his throne. It was murder wrapped in the language of political necessity. For Nzinga, the loss was devastating beyond words. But she was trapped. To challenge her brother openly would risk civil war at the worst possible moment. The Portuguese were still pushing into Ndongo territory. Unity was essential. So she swallowed her grief, her rage, her desire for vengeance. She served her brother's court while he viewed her with constant suspicion. Mbandi proved to be as incompetent as he was cruel. Under his leadership, Ndongo's military situation deteriorated rapidly. Battles were lost. Territory was surrendered. The Portuguese captured the fortress at Ambaka, a strategic position that controlled access to the kingdom's interior. From there, they launched raids deeper and deeper into Mbundu lands. The flow of captured people to Luanda's slave markets accelerated. By 1621, Ndongo faced catastrophe. The Portuguese had appointed a new governor, the same João Correia de Sousa, who would later face Nzinga in that famous meeting. He was determined to finish what his predecessors had started, the complete subjugation of Ndongo. Mbandi finally realized he needed help. He needed someone who could negotiate effectively with the Portuguese, someone with intelligence and diplomatic skill. He needed someone who could command respect. However much it galled him, however much he feared and resented her, he needed his sister. In 1622, he sent Nzinga to Luanda as his official ambassador. It was an extraordinary decision. Sending a woman on such a crucial diplomatic mission was almost unprecedented. But Mbandi understood, perhaps dimly, that Nzinga was Ndongo's best hope. She spoke Portuguese fluently. She understood European thinking. She had the force of personality to stand toe-to-toe with colonial officials. If anyone could secure a favorable treaty, it was her. For Nzinga, the mission was both opportunity and danger. She would be entering the heart of Portuguese power, where her life would depend on her wits. The Portuguese were known to seize African ambassadors as hostages when negotiations soured. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and she might never leave Luanda alive. But this was also her chance. Her chance to prove herself on the greatest stage, her chance to save her people, her chance to show that an African woman could match any European man in intelligence and courage. She prepared with meticulous care. She assembled a delegation that would impress the Portuguese with its sophistication. Advisors, warriors, attendants, all dressed in the finest garments Ndongo could provide. She studied everything available about Governor Correia de Sousa. She analyzed Portuguese weaknesses as carefully as their strengths. The journey to Luanda took days. As Nzinga's party approached the coast, they passed through territories scarred by the slave trade, burned villages, abandoned fields, an atmosphere of pervasive terror. And then Luanda itself came into view. The city was a monument to human suffering. Portuguese colonists and merchants mingled with enslaved Africans who served them. The harbor was crowded with ships, many of them slave vessels preparing for the brutal Middle Passage to the Americas. The sound of chains, the smell of the sea mixed with human misery, the cries of people being loaded onto ships like cargo. This was where her people ended up. This was the fate she had come to prevent. Governor Correia de Sousa received her delegation with calculated contempt. He had heard of this African princess, and he intended to put her in her place. The meeting location, the seating arrangement, every detail was designed to establish Portuguese superiority and African subordination. When Nzinga entered his reception hall and saw the ornate chair on its platform, saw the reed mats on the floor, she understood immediately what was happening. This was a test. The governor expected her to accept humiliation as the price of negotiation. He expected her to sit below him, literally and symbolically diminished. The moment stretched. Every eye in the room watched to see what this African woman would do. And then Nzinga made her move. The gesture to her attendant. The man dropping to his hands and knees, Nzinga sitting upon his back with perfect poise, her eyes meeting the governor's with absolute confidence. She had transformed the governor's trap into her triumph. She had refused subordination without giving the Portuguese any excuse to claim disrespect. She had asserted her equality through an act so bold, so unexpected, so perfectly executed, that even her enemies had to admire it. The negotiations that followed revealed another dimension of Nzinga's capabilities. She did not just match the Portuguese in diplomatic skill, she exceeded them. Nzinga spoke Portuguese with such fluency that the translators became almost unnecessary. She quoted previous treaties between Portugal and Ndongo from memory, citing specific clauses and dates. She pointed out, with devastating precision, every promise the Portuguese had made and broken, every agreement they had violated, every act of aggression they had committed while claiming to seek peace. Governor Correia de Sousa found himself arguing with someone who knew Portuguese colonial policy better than many of his own officials. Nzinga had done her research. She understood the internal politics of the Portuguese Empire, the pressures they faced, the limitations of their resources. She knew that Portugal was a small country, stretched dangerously thin across 3 continents. She knew that the wars in Ndongo were expensive and yielding diminishing returns. And she used that knowledge like a weapon. She challenged the very foundations of Portuguese claims to moral authority. How could a Christian nation, she asked, engage in the mass enslavement of human beings? How could they speak of bringing civilization while spreading death and destruction? How could they claim to want peace while launching unprovoked attacks on African kingdoms? These were not merely rhetorical flourishes. They were calculated arguments designed to create doubt, to establish a moral framework that favored Ndongo's position, to remind the Portuguese that their actions contradicted their professed values. The negotiations continued for days. Nzinga proved willing to compromise when necessary. She understood that diplomacy required give and take. She agreed that Ndongo would maintain peaceful relations with Portuguese territories, would permit certain trade activities, would not harbor Portugal's enemies. In return, she demanded Portuguese withdrawal from occupied Ndongo lands, the release of prisoners taken in recent raids, and recognition of her brother's sovereignty over the kingdom. But the Portuguese had one more demand. They insisted that Nzinga convert to Christianity. This was standard Portuguese colonial practice. They viewed Christian conversion as both a religious duty and a tool of political control. African leaders who converted could be portrayed as willing partners in Portuguese civilization rather than conquered subjects. Nzinga considered this demand carefully. She was not naive about what the Portuguese intended. Christian conversion was meant to create cultural subordination, to replace African beliefs and practices with European ones, to make Africans see themselves through European eyes. But Nzinga also understood strategic sacrifice. If accepting baptism would secure the treaty that could save her people, then the price was acceptable. Her identity, her culture, her connection to her ancestors could not be washed away by holy water and Latin prayers. In 1622, in a ceremony attended by Portuguese officials and Catholic clergy, she was baptized. She took the Christian name Ana de Sousa, after the governor's wife, who served as her godmother. It was a gesture of apparent submission that actually revealed Nzinga's strategic brilliance. She gave the Portuguese what they wanted symbolically, while losing nothing of substance. She could claim Christian identity when it served her purposes, while maintaining her connection to Mbundu's spiritual traditions. She could operate in both worlds, belonging fully to neither, but able to use both. The treaty was finalized. On paper, it appeared to be a diplomatic triumph. The Portuguese agreed to withdraw from captured territories, to return prisoners, to recognize Ndongo's independence. In exchange, Ndongo would maintain peace and acknowledge a vague Portuguese overlordship that meant little in practical terms. Nzinga returned to Ndongo's capital with what seemed like a favorable settlement. She had averted immediate disaster through the force of her intellect and her diplomatic skill. But she harbored no illusions about Portuguese intentions. History had taught her that European colonial powers signed treaties with African states only to violate them whenever convenient. The agreement she had negotiated would last only as long as the Portuguese found it useful. She had bought time, nothing more. Time for Ndongo to recover, to rebuild, to prepare for the conflicts that would inevitably come. But something else had happened in Luanda that was perhaps more important than the treaty itself. Nzinga had established her reputation. The story of the meeting spread rapidly, carried by traders and travelers across the region. An African princess who sat on her servant's back rather than accept a position of inferiority. An African woman who matched European diplomats in intelligence and courage. For African communities living under constant threat of enslavement, the story offered something precious: hope. If Nzinga could stand equal to the Portuguese, then perhaps dignity could not be taken away, no matter how powerful the oppressor. The image was powerful and inspiring, a symbol of resistance that transcended the specific details of diplomacy. Among the Portuguese, reactions were mixed. Some officials admired Nzinga's capabilities while simultaneously fearing them. Governor Correia de Sousa sent reports to Lisbon describing her with a combination of respect and unease. He acknowledged her formidable intelligence while warning that she could pose a serious threat if she ever gained real power in Ndongo. That warning would prove prophetic faster than anyone expected. Nzinga returned to find her brother's position deteriorating. The Portuguese, true to form, showed little intention of honoring the treaty. Withdrawals did not materialize. Prisoners remained in captivity. Raids continued. Mbandi had staked everything on the treaty, providing breathing space, and instead found himself weakened, having made concessions for nothing. His support among Ndongo's nobility crumbled. Nobles questioned his judgment, his courage, his capacity to defend the kingdom. Whispers circulated through the court. Perhaps Ndongo needed different leadership. Perhaps the wrong sibling sat on the throne. In 1624, King Mbandi died suddenly. The exact circumstances remain shrouded in historical uncertainty. Some sources suggest he took his own life, despondent over his failures and increasingly isolated. Other accounts hint at more sinister possibilities. Perhaps Nzinga or her supporters arranged his death, viewing his continued rule as a fatal threat to the kingdom's survival. Still others claim natural causes, illness brought on by the stress of his position. The truth died with Mbandi. What matters is what happened next. Nzinga declared herself queen, not regent, not queen mother acting for a male heir, queen in her own right, sovereign ruler of Ndongo. It was an audacious move that defied Mbundu tradition. Women could wield considerable power in Mbundu society as advisors, as rulers of subsidiary territories, as queen mothers. But claiming the title of supreme ruler was virtually unprecedented. Nzinga was smashing through centuries of custom and expectation. She understood the challenge she faced. She needed to secure support from nobles who had been conditioned to see male leadership as natural and proper. She needed to act quickly before the Portuguese could exploit the succession crisis or before rival claimants could organize opposition. Her response was characteristically bold. She emphasized her qualifications relentlessly. She reminded everyone of her diplomatic triumph in Luanda, pointing out that she had achieved more through negotiation than her brother had through warfare. She stressed her royal lineage, her education in statecraft, her deep knowledge of both Mbundu traditions and Portuguese tactics. She promised strong, stable leadership. She promised to reverse the losses of recent years and restore Ndongo to the power it had known under their father. To address concerns about gender, Nzinga made strategic symbolic moves. She began dressing in ways that blended male and female elements, sometimes appearing in warrior garb rather than traditional royal women's clothing. She participated personally in combat training and military planning. She emphasized her martial capabilities, making clear she could lead in war as effectively as any man. But symbols alone would not secure her position. She needed substance. She immediately reorganized Ndongo's military structures, recognizing that conventional warfare played to Portuguese strengths. Large set-piece battles favored the side with superior firepower and disciplined formations. The Portuguese had both. Instead, Nzinga emphasized guerrilla tactics, mobility, surprise attacks. She dispersed Ndongo's forces into smaller, more flexible units that could strike quickly and fade back into familiar terrain before Portuguese reinforcements could arrive. She trained her warriors in hit-and-run tactics that would neutralize European technological advantages. She also addressed Ndongo's critical vulnerability, the lack of firearms. While Mbundu warriors were skilled with traditional weapons, they could not match the killing power of Portuguese muskets and cannons. Nzinga established networks to acquire guns through trade, sometimes dealing with Dutch merchants eager to undermine Portuguese colonial ambitions, other times through captured weapons taken in raids. Her administrative reforms were equally important. She recognized that the slave trade had created perverse incentives throughout the region. Leaders waged war not over land or honor, but to capture people for sale to Europeans. This pattern was destroying African societies from within. Nzinga worked to redirect Ndongo's economy. She promoted agriculture, craft production, and trade in goods rather than people. She sought to make Ndongo prosperous through peaceful commerce rather than violent predation. But even as she implemented these reforms, Nzinga faced a fundamental problem. Ndongo itself was compromised. The Portuguese controlled much of the territory that had once belonged to the kingdom. The capital was under constant threat. Many of Ndongo's people had been enslaved or had fled to neighboring regions. She had inherited a hollow shell. If she was to secure her people's survival, she needed to think beyond Ndongo. She needed to be bold, creative, willing to make difficult decisions. The answer lay to the east. Matamba was a prosperous kingdom that controlled important trade routes and agricultural lands. It had maintained independence from both the Portuguese and Ndongo, though it had complex relationships with both. In the mid-1620s, Matamba's ruling dynasty faced internal conflicts that created an opportunity. Nzinga made a calculated decision. Rather than remain in Ndongo fighting a defensive war against overwhelming Portuguese pressure, she would relocate her power base to Matamba. This was strategic repositioning, not abandonment. From Matamba, she could rebuild strength and eventually reclaim Ndongo's lost territories. It was a gamble, but Nzinga had always been willing to take risks when potential rewards justified them. The process of establishing control over Matamba was complex, involving both diplomacy and military force. Nzinga forged alliances with factions who saw her as preferable to the existing ruling structure. She used her military forces to pressure and eventually overthrow Matamba's queen. By around 1631, Nzinga had successfully established herself as ruler of Matamba while still claiming authority over Ndongo. She now controlled a consolidated territory with greater resources and better defensive positions than Ndongo alone could provide. This period revealed another dimension of Nzinga's character, her ruthlessness when she believed it necessary. Historical records contain accounts of harsh measures she took against rivals and those who resisted her authority. She could be unforgiving to those she viewed as traitors. She was willing to use violence to secure her position. These actions trouble modern sensibilities, but they must be understood in context. Nzinga operated in a world of extraordinary brutality where the Portuguese massacred entire villages without hesitation. In such an environment, mercy could appear as weakness. And weakness meant not just personal defeat, but the destruction of her people. Nzinga chose survival. She did what she believed survival required. Her establishment as Queen of Matamba, while claiming Ndongo, created a curious political situation. She now ruled or claimed multiple territories, making her one of the most powerful leaders in the region. But this power came with enormous responsibilities. She needed to integrate diverse populations under her authority. She needed to maintain military pressure against the Portuguese while managing complex diplomatic relationships with other African states. She needed to build economic systems that could sustain a prolonged war effort. One of her most controversial decisions concerned the slave trade itself. Historical evidence suggests that Nzinga, despite her opposition to Portuguese enslavement of her own people, participated in the slave trade when it served her strategic interests. She raided communities allied with the Portuguese, taking captives who were either integrated into her society, held for ransom, or traded for weapons and goods she needed. This participation in the very system she was fighting presents a moral complexity that cannot be easily resolved. Some historians argue she was simply a pragmatist, willing to use any available tool to resist Portuguese control. Others suggest she may have distinguished between different forms of enslavement, viewing the incorporation of war captives into Mbundu society as fundamentally different from the chattel slavery of the Atlantic trade. What is clear is that Nzinga's moral universe was shaped by her primary commitment, the survival and independence of her people. Everything else was subordinate to that goal. If achieving it meant making alliances with slavers, she would. If it meant participating in practices she might have found distasteful, she would. If it meant being ruthless with enemies and rivals, she would. This was not hypocrisy. It was the calculation of a leader operating in desperate circumstances where the alternative to compromise was annihilation. By the early 1630s, Nzinga had achieved something remarkable. She had consolidated rule over Matamba. She had maintained her claim to Ndongo despite Portuguese occupation. She had built a military force capable of challenging European armies. She had transformed herself from a princess serving as her brother's ambassador into one of the most formidable political and military leaders in Central Africa. She had done this despite opposition based on her gender, despite operating with far fewer resources than her enemies, despite constant Portuguese aggression. But the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The Portuguese were not about to accept an independent, hostile power in the heart of territory they sought to control. They would pursue Nzinga with armies, with treachery, with unrelenting pressure. And Nzinga, for her part, was not content merely to survive. She dreamed of driving the Portuguese entirely from her lands, of restoring Ndongo to its former glory, of building a kingdom that could stand as a beacon of African independence in an age of European expansion. The question was whether she had the strength, the cunning, and the endurance to turn that dream into reality. The answer would be written in blood and fire across the next 2 decades. The 1630s and 1640s would test every aspect of Nzinga's leadership. These were decades defined by constant warfare, by alliances forged and broken, by a level of strategic complexity that would have overwhelmed lesser leaders. Nzinga was no longer simply defending a kingdom. She was leading a sustained resistance movement that would challenge the very foundations of Portuguese power in West Central Africa. The Portuguese viewed Nzinga as more than just an obstacle. She had become a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. If an African woman could defy Portugal's armies and maintain her independence, what message did that send to other African leaders contemplating resistance? What did it mean for Portuguese prestige throughout their global empire? Nzinga had to be defeated, decisively, publicly, completely. The Portuguese strategy was multifaceted. They launched direct military expeditions, sending armies with firearms and artillery deep into Matamba territory. They worked to economically isolate Nzinga, controlling trade routes and cutting off her access to weapons and goods. They attempted to turn her allies against her, offering inducements to African leaders who would break with her and submit to Portuguese authority. And they spread propaganda portraying her as a tyrant, a usurper, an enemy of Christianity and civilization itself. Nzinga countered each strategy with remarkable ingenuity. Against Portuguese military expeditions, she employed the guerrilla tactics she had been refining for years. Her forces avoided direct confrontation with large Portuguese armies. Instead, they harassed supply lines, ambushed isolated units, struck at vulnerable positions, and melted back into the countryside. The terrain worked to her advantage. Matamba's highlands and forests were difficult for European forces to navigate, especially when local populations provided intelligence to Nzinga rather than to the invaders. Portuguese soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy they could rarely see, dying from ambushes and disease, while achieving nothing of strategic value. One of Nzinga's most effective innovations was her use of highly mobile warrior units. She organized her forces into disciplined companies that could move quickly, live off the land, and maintain cohesion during extended campaigns. These units included warriors skilled with traditional weapons and those trained in firearms. Her commanders understood both conventional and irregular warfare, able to switch between tactics as circumstances demanded. She also established a network of fortified positions throughout Matamba. These were not elaborate European-style castles, but practical defensive strongholds that used natural features like hills and rivers, supplemented by earthworks and palisades. They provided refuge for civilian populations during Portuguese attacks and secure bases from which her forces could launch operations. The economic war was equally crucial. Nzinga understood that Portuguese colonial power rested on the slave trade and resource extraction. She worked systematically to disrupt both. Her forces attacked Portuguese trading posts and the African intermediaries who supplied them with captives. She raided caravans carrying goods to the coast, seizing weapons, cloth, and valuable items. She attempted to redirect trade flows toward territories under her influence, building alternative commercial networks that would weaken Portuguese economic power while strengthening her own. But the most significant development of this period was Nzinga's relationship with the Imbangala. These were fierce warrior societies that had emerged during the turbulent years of Portuguese expansion. They operated as mercenaries and raiders, developing a fearsome reputation for combat effectiveness and willingness to engage in extreme violence. Initially, they had allied with the Portuguese, serving as auxiliaries in campaigns against Ndongo and other African states. Nzinga recognized both the threat the Imbangala posed and the opportunity they represented. She decided to bring them into her coalition through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and demonstration of her own military prowess. This was not easy. The Imbangala valued martial skill above all else. They respected only strength. Nzinga had to prove herself according to their warrior codes, had to show that she could lead in battle, that she could share the dangers and hardships her soldiers faced. Historical accounts from this period describe her personally leading forces into combat, fighting alongside her warriors, wielding weapons with practiced skill. She dressed in military garb, participated directly in operations, demonstrated the physical courage that Imbangala culture demanded of leaders. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, they reflect a reality. Nzinga was not a distant ruler directing forces from a palace. She was an active military commander who shared the dangers of war with her soldiers. By the mid-1630s, significant numbers of Imbangala warriors had joined Nzinga's cause. They brought military skills and ruthless effectiveness that made her forces even more formidable. The alliance was controversial. The Imbangala's reputation for violence and their role in the slave trade made them problematic allies for a leader fighting colonial oppression. But Nzinga valued their military contribution and believed she could channel their energies toward resistance rather than predation. Then, in 1641, everything changed. Portugal was locked in a wider struggle with the Dutch Republic, one of Europe's great powers. The Dutch were challenging Portuguese colonial dominance across multiple theaters, including West Africa. In a stunning development, Dutch forces attacked and captured Luanda itself, seizing the Portuguese colonial capital. Nzinga immediately recognized the opportunity. She reached out to the Dutch, proposing an alliance against their common Portuguese enemy. The Dutch saw the strategic value of partnering with the most powerful indigenous leader in the region. An alliance was formed, one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of Nzinga's career. Here was an African queen, operating from an interior kingdom, forming a military and commercial alliance with a major European power on terms of approximate equality. This was not subordination, this was partnership. The Dutch-Nzinga alliance proved devastatingly effective. Combined operations involving Dutch military forces and Nzinga's warriors pushed the Portuguese back across wide areas. Towns and fortresses that had been under Portuguese control for decades fell to the Allies. Trade routes were secured. Portuguese economic power contracted dramatically. For a brief, shining period, it seemed as though the dream of driving the Portuguese entirely from the region might actually be achievable. The coordination between Dutch and Nzinga's forces was impressive. Dutch units, with their superior naval power and artillery, could attack Portuguese positions from the coast and along rivers. Nzinga's forces operated in the interior, cutting off Portuguese retreat routes and preventing them from consolidating defensive positions. The Portuguese found themselves caught between two effective military forces, unable to concentrate strength against either without exposing themselves to the other. But the alliance was not without tensions. The Dutch had their own commercial interests. While they opposed Portuguese slavery operations, they were quite willing to engage in the slave trade themselves under different arrangements. Nzinga had to navigate these complexities carefully, ensuring that her alliance with the Dutch served her interests without simply replacing Portuguese exploitation with Dutch exploitation. She insisted on maintaining her autonomy, making clear that she was an ally, not a subordinate. She negotiated the terms of their cooperation carefully, always protecting Matamba's sovereignty, always ensuring that she retained final authority over her own forces and territories. During this period, Nzinga also worked to build a broader coalition of African states opposed to Portuguese colonialism. She reached out to the Kingdom of Congo, which had its own troubled relationship with the Portuguese. She communicated with other Mbundu leaders, with communities that had fled Portuguese slavery, with kingdoms farther east and south. Her vision was ambitious, coordinated African resistance that could match European power through unity and strategic cooperation. This diplomatic effort had mixed results. Some African leaders were willing to coordinate with Nzinga, recognizing the common threat they faced. Others were more cautious, concerned about the risks of open opposition to Portuguese power or suspicious of Nzinga's ambitions. Still others had become so dependent on Portuguese trade goods, so implicated in the slave trade, that they saw their interests aligned with the colonizers rather than with African resistance. The political landscape was fragmented and complex. Building lasting coalitions proved enormously challenging. The mid-1640s saw intense military campaigning. Nzinga's forces, often in coordination with Dutch units, launched attacks throughout Portuguese-controlled territories. They targeted slave traders, destroyed plantations, freed enslaved people, seized Portuguese goods and weapons. These campaigns took a terrible toll on Portuguese colonial infrastructure. Even after the Portuguese recaptured Luanda in 1648, their control over the interior remained severely compromised. The costs of maintaining their colony spiraled upward, while returns from the slave trade declined. But the war also took its toll on Nzinga's people. Constant military mobilization meant less labor available for agriculture and productive activities. The disruption of trade created shortages of goods people had come to depend on. Casualties mounted as battles were fought and villages were raided. Families were separated. Communities were displaced. The social fabric of the region was strained to breaking point. Nzinga herself was aging. She was now in her 60s, an advanced age for the time, especially given the physical demands of her lifestyle. But she showed no signs of slowing down. Historical accounts describe her as still actively involved in military operations, still making strategic decisions, still commanding the respect and loyalty of her followers. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, fueled by a lifetime of struggle and an unwavering commitment to her people's freedom. The recapture of Luanda by Portuguese forces in 1648 marked the beginning of the end for the Dutch presence in the region. Without their capital and facing challenges in other parts of their global empire, the Dutch gradually withdrew from West Central Africa. This was a devastating blow to Nzinga's position. She had counted on Dutch military and economic support to balance Portuguese power. Without it, she found herself once again facing the Portuguese largely alone. The Portuguese, having reclaimed their colonial capital, sought to re-establish dominance. But they had learned painful lessons from the previous years of conflict. They had come to respect Nzinga's military capabilities. They recognized that defeating her through military force alone would be difficult and costly. They began to shift strategy, placing greater emphasis on negotiation, on attempting to bring Nzinga into some accommodation with Portuguese power rather than destroying her outright. For Nzinga, these overtures presented a dilemma. She had spent decades fighting the Portuguese, sacrificing everything to maintain independence, but she was also realistic about the limits of her power. Matamba was secure, but reclaiming all of Ndongo seemed increasingly unlikely. Her people were exhausted from constant warfare. Perhaps it was time to secure what could be secured, to ensure that Matamba at least would remain free, even if the larger goal of driving the Portuguese from the region entirely had to be deferred to future generations. The late 1640s and early 1650s saw sporadic fighting punctuated by diplomatic communications. Portuguese officials and Nzinga's representatives met periodically to discuss possible terms for peace. These negotiations were complicated by mutual distrust, by competing interests among various Portuguese factions, by Nzinga's determination not to accept any agreement that would compromise her sovereignty. She would negotiate, she would make pragmatic concessions, but she would not surrender. She would not accept Portuguese authority over her kingdom. During this period, Nzinga also worked to secure her legacy. She had no direct heirs, a consequence of the tragedies of her early life. She needed to ensure that Matamba would remain stable and independent after her death. She groomed potential successors from among her extended family and trusted advisors. She strengthened Matamba's administrative structures, ensuring the kingdom had institutions that could function without her direct leadership. She worked to secure Matamba's economy, promoting agriculture and trade that would sustain the kingdom through future challenges. Her relationship with Christianity during this period remained complex and syncretic. She had been baptized decades earlier as part of her diplomatic strategy. Throughout her wars with the Portuguese, her relationship with the Catholic Church had been complicated. At times she supported missionaries and permitted church construction. At other times she expelled clergy she viewed as Portuguese agents. Now, in her later years, she seemed to move toward more genuine engagement with Christian faith, though always on her own terms, always integrated with rather than replacing traditional Mbundu beliefs. In 1656, after decades of conflict, a peace treaty was finally concluded between Nzinga and the Portuguese. The terms reflected the military stalemate that had emerged. Portugal recognized Matamba's independence under Nzinga's rule. Nzinga agreed to permit Portuguese missionaries in her territory and to maintain peaceful commercial relations. Neither side achieved everything they had sought, but both secured crucial interests. For Portugal, the treaty meant an end to costly military operations and the possibility of stable trade relationships. For Nzinga, it meant recognition of her sovereignty and security for her people. The treaty marked the end of active warfare, but not the end of Nzinga's significance. She had achieved something extraordinary. She had fought the Portuguese Empire to a standstill, maintaining her independence and her people's freedom through decades of conflict. She had proven that African leaders could match European powers in military skill, diplomatic cunning, and sheer determination. She had created a kingdom that would outlast her, a legacy that would inspire future generations. The question now was what she would do with the peace she had fought so hard to achieve. The final years of Nzinga's life were marked by a transformation as profound as any she had undergone. The warrior queen, who had led armies and defied empires, now turned her formidable intelligence to the arts of peace. She was in her 70s, an age that few reached in that era, especially after a life of such constant struggle. But Nzinga remained as sharp, as determined, as visionary as ever. Matamba, under her peacetime rule, developed into something remarkable. The capital became a thriving center of commerce and culture. Markets flourished with traders arriving from across the region and even from Portuguese territories. The goods exchanged were not chains and human misery, but salt and iron, crops and crafts, the products of productive labor rather than violent predation. Agricultural production expanded as people who had spent years fleeing warfare could finally return to their fields. The rhythms of planting and harvest replaced the rhythms of raid and counter-raid. Skilled artisans found patronage and protection, creating works of beauty and utility. The kingdom developed prosperity that had been impossible during the long years of conflict. Nzinga established institutions of governance that could function effectively even in her absence. She appointed capable administrators to oversee different regions of her kingdom. She created courts that could resolve disputes according to law rather than force. She developed systems for collecting taxes that provided state resources without crushing her subjects under unbearable burdens. These administrative achievements are often overlooked in accounts focused on her military career, but they were essential to Matamba's stability and represented skills as impressive as any battlefield victory. Building is harder than destroying. Creating functional institutions is more difficult than leading successful raids. Nzinga excelled at both. One of her key priorities was restructuring Matamba's economy to reduce dependence on the slave trade. This was both moral conviction and practical strategy. She understood that societies built on capturing and selling human beings created unsustainable dynamics. The slave trade encouraged constant warfare, destroyed trust between communities, and made long-term prosperity impossible. Under her direction, Matamba developed thriving agricultural sectors. The kingdom's fertile lands produced surplus grain, vegetables, and other crops for regional trade. Livestock herding expanded, with cattle becoming both wealth and trade commodity. Salt mining and ironworking, traditional sources of regional trade goods, were promoted and protected. Matamba positioned itself as a center for legitimate commerce rather than human trafficking. This economic transformation was never complete. The slave trade remained dominant in the regional economy, and Matamba could not entirely separate itself from this system. But Nzinga succeeded in diversifying her kingdom's economic base, providing greater stability and reducing incentives for conflicts with neighboring communities. Her relationship with Christianity deepened during these final years, though it remained distinctly African in character. After the peace treaty, Portuguese Catholic missionaries were permitted to establish themselves in Matamba. Nzinga supported church construction and provided resources for missionary activities. She participated in Christian rituals and encouraged her subjects to receive religious instruction. By the time of her death, Matamba had a small but growing Christian population and several functioning missions. But Nzinga's Christianity coexisted with traditional Mbundu religious practices. Ancestor veneration continued. Traditional ritual specialists maintained their roles. Spiritual practices that predated Christianity remained integral to daily life. Christian elements were integrated into existing frameworks rather than replacing them. This syncretic approach troubled some European missionaries who wanted complete conversion. But it reflected Nzinga's broader philosophy: take what is useful, adapt it to local circumstances, but never lose core identity. The question of her motives for this deeper engagement with Christianity remains debated. Was it genuine spiritual conviction, political pragmatism to improve relations with the Portuguese, concern for her soul as she contemplated mortality? The historical sources provide no definitive answers. All of these factors likely played some role. What is clear is that Nzinga retained her political independence and cultural identity while engaging with Christianity. She was baptized as Ana de Sousa, but she never ceased to be Nzinga, Queen of Matamba and Ndongo. The Christianity she practiced was filtered through her own understanding, integrated into a worldview that remained fundamentally rooted in African traditions. As she aged, the question of succession became urgent. She had no surviving children, a consequence of her brother's cruelty and the tragedies of her early life. Without a clear line of succession, Matamba could descend into civil war upon her death. Everything she had built could be destroyed by internal conflict, leaving her people vulnerable to Portuguese exploitation. Nzinga addressed this challenge with characteristic foresight. She identified her sister Barbara as her designated successor, working to build support for this choice among Matamba's nobility and military commanders. She ensured that Barbara understood the responsibilities of rule and was prepared to assume them. She gradually transferred administrative functions to her sister, allowing Barbara to gain experience while Nzinga could still provide guidance. She made clear to all that any challenge to Barbara's succession would be considered treason. Historical accounts from the 1650s describe Nzinga as remaining remarkably active despite her advanced age. She continued participating in administrative decisions, receiving foreign visitors and ambassadors, maintaining oversight of her kingdom's affairs. She was known for her sharp mind, her ability to recall details from decades past, her continued capacity for strategic thinking. Age had slowed her physically, but mentally she remained formidable until nearly the end. In 1663, Nzinga fell ill. The exact nature of her illness is not recorded in surviving sources, but those around her understood she was dying. She spent her final days putting her affairs in order, issuing final instructions to officials and advisors, preparing for death with the same thoroughness she had brought to everything in life. According to Catholic sources, she received the last rites of the Church and died in a state of Christian grace. According to Mbundu traditions, she was honored with full ceremonies due a great queen, with proper rituals to ensure her transition to the world of the ancestors. Queen Nzinga died on December 17th, 1663, at approximately 80 years of age. She had ruled for nearly 40 years, through decades of warfare, political upheaval, and cultural transformation. She had led armies, negotiated with European powers, built a kingdom, and secured her people's independence against overwhelming odds. She had transformed herself from a princess in a threatened kingdom into one of the most significant political and military leaders of 17th century Africa. And now, her extraordinary life had come to an end. Her funeral was an event of tremendous significance. Thousands gathered to mourn her passing and celebrate her life. Portuguese officials attended, recognizing the importance of maintaining good relations with Matamba during the transition to new leadership. Representatives from neighboring African kingdoms came to pay respects. Her body was interred with full honors in ceremonies that blended Christian and traditional elements, reflecting the complex cultural synthesis that had characterized her reign. Barbara succeeded to the throne as Nzinga had planned. The succession was smooth, testimony to Nzinga's careful preparation and the loyalty she had inspired. Matamba would continue as an independent kingdom for many years, maintaining its autonomy and cultural identity. The peace with Portugal that Nzinga had negotiated would hold, providing the region with stability that had been absent for decades. But even as life in Matamba continued under new leadership, it was clear that something irreplaceable had been lost. Nzinga had been more than a political leader or military commander. She had been a symbol, a living embodiment of resistance to colonial control, proof that Africans could stand equal to Europeans in intelligence, courage, and political skill. Her death marked the end of an era, the passing of a generation that had witnessed the first great confrontation between African independence and European colonialism in West Central Africa. More than 3.5 centuries have passed since Queen Nzinga's death, yet her legacy continues to resonate across Africa and throughout the African diaspora. She has become a symbol of resistance, of female empowerment, of African dignity in the face of colonial oppression. But beyond symbolism, what is her historical significance? What lessons does her life offer? Nzinga's most obvious legacy is political. She demonstrated that African leaders could successfully resist European colonialism through military prowess, diplomatic skill, and strategic flexibility. While many African states were conquered or subordinated during the age of European expansion, Nzinga maintained her independence for 4 decades. Matamba survived as a sovereign kingdom throughout her lifetime and beyond. Her success came not from any single strategy, but from her ability to adapt to changing circumstances. When conventional warfare failed against Portuguese firepower, she adopted guerrilla tactics. When military force alone was insufficient, she pursued diplomacy. When the Portuguese seemed too powerful to defeat directly, she sought European allies to balance their power. When opportunities arose, she seized them boldly. When defeat loomed, she retreated to rebuild strength. This strategic flexibility, this willingness to use whatever tools were available without being locked into rigid positions, was perhaps her greatest political gift. Nzinga also left a legacy as a female leader who succeeded in a male-dominated world. She ruled not as a regent acting for a male heir, but as queen in her own right, commanding armies and making policy without male mediation. She faced significant opposition based on her gender, and she overcame it through demonstrated competence, political cunning, and sheer force of personality. For women across Africa and beyond who have faced discrimination based on gender, Nzinga's example offers powerful inspiration. She proved that women could lead, could fight, could rule as effectively as any man. Yet, her legacy is complicated by moral ambiguities. She participated in the slave trade, even while fighting against the enslavement of her own people. She could be ruthless, even cruel, to those she saw as enemies or threats. She made alliances with Europeans who were themselves colonizers and exploiters. These complexities remind us that historical figures are products of their times, shaped by the moral frameworks and practical necessities of their eras. Understanding Nzinga requires neither worship nor condemnation, but appreciation for the difficult choices she faced and the context in which she made them. Her cultural legacy in Angola and throughout Central Africa remains profound. She is celebrated as a national hero, a founding figure in Angolan identity. Schools, streets, and institutions bear her name. Her image appears on currency and in public monuments. She is invoked in political discourse as a symbol of national pride and resistance to foreign control. During Angola's long struggle for independence from Portuguese colonialism in the 20th century, Nzinga was frequently cited as an ancestral model of resistance, proof that fighting for freedom was part of the nation's historical identity. In the broader African diaspora, particularly in the Americas where millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported, Nzinga has become an important figure in reclaiming African history and identity. For centuries, racist ideologies portrayed Africa as a continent without history, without great leaders, without achievements worth remembering. The recovery and celebration of figures like Nzinga challenges these narratives. She stands as evidence of African political sophistication, military capability, and cultural achievement. She reminds descendants of enslaved Africans that they come from peoples with proud histories, peoples who fought for their freedom and dignity. Nzinga's life offers timeless lessons about leadership. She understood that effective leadership requires more than courage or intelligence, though she possessed both in abundance. It requires the ability to read situations accurately, to understand the motivations and capabilities of allies and enemies alike, to make difficult decisions under pressure, and to maintain resolve in the face of setbacks and defeats. Her diplomatic skills remain particularly instructive. Nzinga operated in an environment where she was usually militarily weaker than her primary adversary, where resources were scarce, where a single major mistake could lead to her kingdom's destruction. Yet she not only survived but often thrived, outmaneuvering opponents through careful negotiation, strategic alliances, and the ability to identify and exploit enemies' weaknesses. She understood that diplomacy was not simply about reaching agreements, but about managing perceptions, building relationships, and creating situations where her interests aligned with those of more powerful actors. For modern Angola, Nzinga represents a link to a pre-colonial past, a time when African societies were independent and self-governing. After centuries of Portuguese colonial rule followed by devastating civil war, Angola has struggled to build a stable, prosperous nation. In this context, Nzinga serves as a symbol of national identity and continuity, a reminder that the Angolan people have a long history of resistance and resilience. Her relevance extends beyond Angola to the broader African continent. In the decades following World War II, dozens of African nations gained independence from European colonial rule. Many sought historical figures who could serve as symbols of resistance to colonialism and models of indigenous leadership. Nzinga became part of a pantheon of African heroes whose stories were taught in schools and celebrated in national holidays. For women specifically, her example has been particularly powerful. Her story has been used to challenge patriarchal assumptions about women's capabilities and proper roles. If an African woman in the 17th century could lead armies, negotiate with European powers, and rule a kingdom for 4 decades, then clearly women today can participate fully in all domains of public life. Her story has been told through multiple artistic media. Historians have written scholarly biographies, novelists have created fictionalized accounts, filmmakers have produced documentaries and dramatic films. Musicians have written songs celebrating her achievements. Each rendering interprets her story differently, reflecting the concerns and perspectives of different times and communities. This ongoing creative engagement ensures that she remains a living presence in cultural memory rather than merely a historical artifact. Yet for all the ways Nzinga has been remembered and celebrated, certain aspects of her life remain contested or unclear. The exact circumstances of her brother's death, her involvement in the slave trade, the sincerity of her Christian faith, the details of her military campaigns, all remain subjects of debate among historians. The sources are incomplete, sometimes contradictory, filtered through the biases of those who recorded them. We will likely never know with certainty many details of her life. But this incompleteness does not diminish her historical significance. What we do know is enough to establish her as one of the most important African leaders of the early modern period. As we reflect on Nzinga's life from our vantage point in the 21st century, what stands out most is her refusal to accept the role that colonial powers sought to impose on her and her people. She refused to be subordinated, to be enslaved, to be erased. She fought for her people's freedom and dignity with every tool at her disposal. She adapted, she survived, she ultimately triumphed in maintaining her independence when so many others succumbed to European power. This refusal, this insistence on self-determination and dignity is perhaps her greatest legacy. The challenges facing Africa today are vastly different from those Nzinga confronted. The age of direct colonial rule has ended, though its legacies persist in economic structures, political boundaries, and cultural attitudes. The struggles now are against poverty, corruption, conflict, and the ongoing effects of centuries of exploitation. Yet the fundamental question remains the same. Can African peoples control their own destinies, determine their own futures, and maintain their dignity in a world where power is still unequally distributed? Nzinga's example suggests that the answer is yes, but that achieving self-determination requires courage, intelligence, adaptability, and unwavering commitment. In small villages across Angola and in diaspora communities around the world, grandmothers still tell stories of Queen Nzinga to their grandchildren. They tell of her defiance in the Portuguese governor's hall, refusing to sit on the floor. They tell of her military victories against overwhelming odds. They tell of her wisdom in peace and her courage in war. They tell these stories not as ancient history, but as living lessons, reminders of who they are and what they are capable of. In this way, Nzinga's spirit continues to walk among her people, inspiring new generations to stand tall, to resist injustice, to refuse subordination. Her grave in Matamba, though its exact location is now uncertain, is sacred ground. The kingdom she built eventually fell to new waves of Portuguese expansion and the chaotic violence of the 19th century slave trade. The political structures she created did not survive intact to the present day. But the memory of what she achieved, the example she set, the proof she provided that Africans could and would resist colonial control, these have endured. They endured through centuries of slavery and colonialism. They endured through the struggles for independence. They endure today in every African who stands up for their rights, every woman who refuses to accept artificial limits on her potential, every person who believes that human dignity is universal and inalienable. In the final analysis, Queen Nzinga's greatest achievement may not have been any single military victory or diplomatic success, but rather the simple fact that she lived her life on her own terms. She refused to be defined by others' expectations or limited by others' prejudices. She claimed her authority and exercised it with skill and determination. She made choices, some admirable, some morally complex, all profoundly human. She fought, she ruled, she survived, she endured, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy that continues to inspire, to challenge, and to remind us of the extraordinary things that human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender their dignity and their freedom. Centuries may have passed, but her spirit remains. In the mountains of Angola, where she once led her warriors. In the histories that scholars continue to write. In the stories that parents tell their children. In the hearts of all who struggle for justice and self-determination. There Queen Nzinga lives on. Her name endures as a testament to courage, to intelligence, to the unbreakable human spirit. She was a warrior, a diplomat, a queen. She was Nzinga, and the world will never forget her name. If this story of resistance and dignity has moved you, if you found inspiration in the tale of this extraordinary woman who refused to bow before empire, then Mementos Historians invites you to join us on this journey through Africa's untold histories. There are countless other powerful stories from the continent's past, tales of heroes and heroines whose names deserve to be remembered, whose legacies deserve to be honored. Subscribe to this channel, and together we can ensure that these stories are told, that these voices are heard, and that history remembers not just the colonizers, but those who resisted them with every fiber of their being. Queen Nzinga's struggle continues every time we refuse to let her story fade into silence. Thank you for watching.